Since the Brothers Grimm published the Hansel and Gretel story in German in 1812, it's been translated into 160 different languages. Murder, enslavement, attempted cannibalism, and child abandonment, they're all part of this horrific narrative. Unfortunately, the story's beginnings are equally, if not more, terrifying. For those who haven't heard the story before, it starts with two kids being left in the woods by their parents, and the parents aren't well-to-do. Hansel and Gretel find out that their parents are trying to get rid of them, so they simply find their way home by following the path of stones that Hansel had put down earlier. In some versions, the mother or stepmother then talks the father into leaving the children again. This time, though, Hansel leaves breadcrumbs so that they could follow those back to the home. But the breadcrumbs are eaten by birds, and the children become lost in the forest. The two kids, starving, wandering aimlessly in the woods, come across a gingerbread house, which they promptly consume. And unbeknownst to them, the house is actually a trap that was set by an old witch, who then forces Gretel to overfeed Hansel so that the witch could eat him. They're able to leave after Gretel tosses the witch into an oven and bolts the door. And when they return home, with all the witch's money and riches that they stole, they discover that their horrible grandmother had vanished and is now presumed to be dead. And then everyone lives happily ever after. The true narrative of Hansel and Gretel, on the other hand, is not happy, though. It's based on a book of folklores and tales that came out of the Baltic countries between 1314 and 1322. This was during the Great Famine. Food was hard to come by. For a very long time, volcanic activity in Southeast Asia and New Zealand changed the weather around the globe, deeply affecting this area. And it caused crops to fail and people to go hungry. Europe was in a real tough spot. Food was already hard to come by, and the Great Famine led to terrible things. One researcher says that the Great Famine destroyed 400,000 square miles of Europe and killed up to 25% of the population in some places. The elderly made purposeful choices to starve themselves to death so that they could very simply spare the lives of young children. Others did worse things, not so much to themselves. They actually murdered infants or abandoned their children. There's also evidence during this time of cannibalism in the area. According to an Irish chronicler, the famine was so terrible that people removed bodies from cemeteries and then removed the meat from the skulls and ate it. Some women even ate their children out of hunger. It was from this terrifying chaos that Hansel and Gretel's story was born. The warning stories that came before Hansel and Gretel all dealt with issues of abandonment and survival in some way. The forest was almost always used as a setting for hazards and magic and death. Henriette Dorothea Wilde, a neighbor of the Grimm brothers who told many of their stories for their first book, was the direct source for the Hansel and Gretel story as we know it. And in the end, she married Wilhelm Grimm. The Grimm brothers' Hansel and Gretel story evolved from the initial form over time. The brothers may have tidied up the stories a little bit by the time they published their final version because they realized youngsters were reading them. And by 1857, the mother who had left her own kids in the story had become the kind of harsh stepmother that you hear about in fairy tales. And the father's status was downgraded in 1857 because now the character felt bad about his actions. Meanwhile, the Hansel and Gretel story continues to evolve. There's versions nowadays for preschoolers, like the story by children's author Mercer Mayer, which doesn't try to deal with any issues related to children being left behind. The tale makes sporadic attempts to return to its ominous origins, though, let it be through movies or reiterations of the story for the sake of horror. The original Hansel and Gretel story, though, is much more sinister than its current iteration. These are Interesting Things with JC.